The sun was a low, bleeding ball on the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the dusty main street of that forgotten frontier town. A harsh wind whipped loose straw and tumbleweeds across the wooden planks of the boardwalk, rattling the windows of shuttered shops. In the distance, the faint sound of a horse's hooves echoed, deliberate and steady, like a drumbeat counting down the moments before something was about to change. Inside a small, dimly lit saloon, a man hunched over a table, sweat darkening his worn coat, eyes darting toward the swinging doors every time they creaked. He was a man who owed more than he could ever hope to repay, and tonight desperation clung to him like a second skin. Across from him, a woman stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her heart hammering like a wild stallion in a storm. Her face, framed by strands of dark hair that had escaped the braid she had tried to tame it into, betrayed both fear and quiet defiance. She had heard the whispers, the cruel jest of men who thought women could be bought or bartered like cattle. But she was no one's property. Not now, not ever. Yet the tension in the room pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating, as her husband leaned closer, his voice low but sharp, slicing through the smoke-filled air. "I can settle this debt. If you'll just agree," he said, not looking her in the eye. The words hung in the room like a noose. The man at the table was a gambler and a drinker. It's a kind who thought that a woman's value could balance the scales of his misfortune. But she was more than a score to be settled. She was fire, and the thought of being traded sparked something inside her that even fear could not extinguish. The saloon went still as a figure appeared in the doorway, riding with the confidence of someone who belonged to the land, not the confines of wooden walls and ledgers of debt. Black dust clung to his boots and the wide brim of his hat-shaded eyes that had seen more than most men dared to imagine. He didn't speak at first, just let the room take measure of him, a silent authority that seemed to draw the very air toward him. There was a calm power in the way he moved, the way his gaze swept over the room, and for a moment, even the rowdiest men felt the weight of something larger than themselves. The woman's husband stiffened, as if he had been caught in a spell. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of suspicion and anger. The man dismounted without a word, the leather of his saddle creaking under the movement. His eyes never left hers. There was recognition in that gaze, though they had never met before. It was a recognition of strength, of a spirit that could not be tamed or bought. He stepped closer, the wooden floor groaning under each measured footfall, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "She has no price," he said simply, and the words struck the air with the force of a gunshot. A silence followed, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the murmurs of the saloon and the scratching of wind against the walls. Those few words, spoken with quiet certainty, carried a weight that even the debtor could not ignore. The woman felt a tremor run through her body, a mixture of relief and disbelief. No one had ever spoken like that in her defense. Not her father, not her brother, not even the man who had claimed her as his own. There was courage in that voice, a fearless conviction that promised protection, yet demanded nothing in return. Her heart raced, caught between fear of the unknown and the faint, burning hope that someone had finally seen her worth. The gambler's face twisted, a mask of rage and shame that made his hands clench into fists. "You don't understand," he spat. "This is business. This is the way the world works. A debt has to be paid." The newcomer didn't flinch. He simply looked at the man as if he were a child, trying to bargain with forces far greater than his understanding. "Not all debts can be settled with blood or ownership," he said. His voice carried a strange, almost elemental authority, as if the land itself had lent him strength. And no person should be used as a coin. It's not her, not anyone. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping dust across the street like a wave of warning. Horses neighed in distant corrals, and a few onlookers paused, drawn by the tension radiating from the small building. Something was shifting in the town. Something that had been buried under years of fear, greed, and the harshness of survival. The balance was tipping, and everyone in the room could feel it. The woman swallowed hard, her throat dry, but there was a fire in her chest now. She had been quiet for too long, had survived the cruelest of whispers and the hardest of stares. But today, she would be seen as more than a prize, more than a pawn. She would be seen as herself, whole and unyielding. Yet uncertainty still lingered like smoke from the kerosene lamps around them. She did not know if the man who had spoken for her would stay, if her husband would relent, or if the lawless edges of the territory would allow her freedom to exist at all. The stranger's eyes softened briefly, not in weakness, but in recognition of the path she had walked alone until now. There was an understanding, a silent pact forming in the space between them. Unspoken, but stronger than any contract or bond forged by coin or ink. He did not reach for her, did not touch her, yet his presence was a shield she could feel. Her husband slammed the table, the wood trembling under the force, sending glasses rattling. "I don't need your lessons," he shouted. "She's mine to do with as I please." "No," the stranger said, his voice low, but cutting through the noise with deadly precision. "She is no one's to claim. She chooses her own path." The words hung in the room, heavier than the heat of the setting sun pressing against the dusty windows. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The saloon, the street, even the wind outside, all waited to see what would happen next. Storm was coming, not just of sand and wind, but of decisions, consequences, and courage, tested in ways that no one in the room could yet predict. The woman's hands clenched at her sides, nails biting into palms she barely felt. She knew that what was about to happen would change everything. The choice her husband had made, the intervention of the man who had spoken her worth aloud, and the eyes of the town that had long judged her silently, all converged into a single, trembling moment of truth. Outside, the first stars appeared, pale and distant against the darkening sky. They seemed to watch, silent witnesses to the unfolding reckoning. The wind whispered warnings, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant campfires, and with it, the unspoken promise that nothing would ever be the same. The gambler's face paled, and the room held its breath. The woman's pulse throbbed in her ears. The stranger's calm gaze never wavered, and in that charged silence, one thing became clear. The law of the land could not govern what the heart knew to be right. She was no commodity, no debt to be paid. She was a person, fierce and unbroken, and the world was about to learn it. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the doors of the saloon creaked once more, and a shadow fell across the threshold. Someone or something was coming, and it would change the course of the night forever. The wind howled through the town, rattling boards and hearts alike, and the woman, standing tall now, felt the first real taste of freedom prickling at her skin. But freedom came with a cost, and she knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that waited inside, where debts, pride, and courage would clash. The next moment, the stranger's hand brushed the saddle ready to mount again, and the woman realized the night was far from over. Whatever happened next, the choice was hers and hers alone. The stars above seemed to pulse with anticipation, and in the quiet before the next storm, the words of the stranger lingered like fire in the air. "She has no price." The shadow in the doorway did not move at first, as if weighing the room, taking measure of each person and the unspoken tensions that bound them together. The wind pressed harder against the saloon, rattling the sign outside and sending a spray of dust through the cracks in the boards. The newcomer's eyes flicked toward it, narrowing slightly, and the woman noticed a strange familiarity in his gaze, as if he had seen danger before and had learned to read it in the slightest movement, the smallest sound. The air between them thickened, charged with anticipation, and for the first time that evening she realized the full depth of what had been said. She had been declared priceless in a world that tried to price everything. Her mind drifted back to the long, dry years before tonight. The town had always been a hard place, carved out of desert and stone by men with more ambition than conscience. Her family had arrived when the first boardwalks were being hammered into place, when the saloons smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and when gunfire was as likely as conversation. She had grown up watching her father work the land with calloused hands, seeing her mother labor over a kitchen fire that never seemed to end. Every day had been survival, every night a struggle against fear of what might come over the ridge or through the streets. In that life, she had learned early that kindness was rare, and that the weak were easily lost to debt, to violence, or to the whims of men who believed the world owed them everything. Her husband had come into her life like a storm. At first, there was charm, laughter, the promise of something lighter than the weight of the frontier. But it had not taken long for that charm to curdle into ownership, for the warmth of his attention to become a claim over her. She had tried to endure it, telling herself that survival meant compromise, that keeping peace in a marriage was sometimes a matter of quiet obedience. And yet, even in the smallest moments, she had resisted. Even in the corners of rooms when no one was looking, she had refused to allow herself to be entirely subdued. Tonight, she saw that resistance reflected in the stranger's eyes. The man in the doorway finally stepped inside fully, boots scraping against the floor, leaving a faint trail of dust. His face was lined with experience but not age. There was a steadiness in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, as if the land itself had taught him to move with purpose. There was a story there, one that had yet to be told, but it radiated in every measured movement. The woman felt a strange pull toward him, not of attraction, but of trust, the kind of instinctual certainty that a person gives when they recognize another's integrity without words. The saloon's other patrons shifted uncomfortably, their voices lowering, the laughter fading like a candle snuffed. They had seen men fall over debts, over pride, over foolish bets. But a man who spoke the value of another person aloud, who refused to let blood or gold determine a life, was something new entirely. A few of them glanced at the gambler, whose rage had turned into something quieter, more dangerous. There was shame in his eyes now, but also calculation, the kind that hunts for a way to regain control when all else slips. The woman's thoughts wandered again, back to the early years of her marriage. When the weight of expectation first pressed against her shoulders, she had been young, naive, and desperate to belong somewhere beyond the boundaries of her family's small homestead. She had imagined love as protection, as a shield against the cruelty of the outside world, but soon discovered that love could be twisted into chains. Her husband had been patient at first, gentle in ways that promised safety, but slowly, ever so slowly, he had revealed the man beneath the mask, the one who believed debts could be paid with promises of ownership, and who could justify anything if it served his own survival. Now, standing in the saloon, she could see him as he truly was, a man who saw everything in terms of risk and gain, a man for whom morality was a luxury he could ill afford. Yet, there was fear in him, the recognition that tonight's events had shifted the balance in a way he could not control. His fists tightened and relaxed repeatedly, and the tension radiating from him was so palpable it felt like heat on the back of her neck. The stranger's gaze did not waver, and the woman began to understand why he had intervened. He had come from somewhere the law of the town could not touch, from a life that had taught him the value of justice beyond currency. His voice, quiet but unwavering, had the weight of someone who had survived horrors and learned to measure right from wrong by something deeper than law or ledger. There was a history here, written in the lines of his face and the calm rhythm of his movements, a past she could only guess at, but already respected. Outside, the town seemed to hold its breath. A lone coyote howled from the hills, the sound hollow and echoing like a warning. The wind carried it into the street, rattling signs and loose boards, and the woman felt a shiver run down her spine. That was the same wind that had shaped the land for generations. The same wind that had tested settlers and survivors alike, and now it whispered its own counsel, that nothing in this place came without cost. She realized with both fear and anticipation that the night would be long, and that freedom, if it could be claimed, would demand courage she had only begun to muster. The gambler finally spoke, his voice lower now, less confident but still sharp enough to cut. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said to the stranger, his eyes narrowing with both fury and calculation. "She's part of a debt that has to be settled. That's the way of things. That's the way it's always been." The stranger shook his head slowly, almost imperceptibly. "The way it has been is not the way it must be," he said. The words were quiet but carried like the distant roll of thunder. There was a weight behind them, a sense of inevitability that even the gambler could not ignore. Something had shifted in the air, a line had been crossed, and the town itself seemed to sense the change. The woman felt her pulse quicken. For the first time in years, she sensed that the story she had been living, the one of compromise, fear, and silent endurance, might be rewritten. Yet the uncertainty was as sharp as the wind biting at her cheeks. She did not know what this stranger's presence meant in the larger world, or whether her husband would truly relent. The answers lay somewhere beyond the boardwalk and the saloon doors, beyond the shadows and the wind, in a world she had yet to see fully, but one she instinctively knew was hers to navigate. The stranger's eyes moved to the doors, scanning the horizon beyond the town. There was recognition there, a silent calculation of risk, and a memory that seemed to stretch across years of deserts, canyons, and untamed land. He had walked paths few dared to tread, and now he had come to stand in this room, at this moment, for reasons that were only partially revealed. The woman felt the weight of that history pressing down not in fear, but in anticipation. She knew she was on the cusp of something larger than her fears or her husband's greed, something that could change the course of her life entirely. The gambler's gaze faltered as he glanced toward the door once more. The townspeople watched, their whispers hushed, as if the wind had stolen their voices. Even the bartender paused mid-swipe, glass in hand, sensing that tonight would not end as it had any other night in this dusty frontier town. The tension was a living thing, twisting and turning through the room, catching in every corner. In every crack in the floorboards, in every shadow cast by the swinging lamps, the woman's heart pounded. She had never felt so simultaneously exposed and protected. The stranger's quiet presence promised safety, yet demanded courage. Her husband's greed and fear clashed violently against the stranger's calm authority. And somewhere beyond the doors of the saloon, the night held its own secrets, watching, waiting, testing the resolve of those brave enough to claim their own destinies. She realized then that the story of her life, the one that had been dictated by debts and fear, was only beginning to unfold. She could see the path forming, shadowed and uncertain, stretching beyond the hills and the wind-swept plains. And though she could not yet know where it would lead, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She would never again be a commodity, a solution to another man's problem, or a shadow in her own life. She had begun to step into the light of her own story, and the night was only just opening its first chapter. The wind rattled the saloon doors again, louder this time, as if impatient. A distant drumbeat of hooves echoed from the road beyond, signaling movement, perhaps danger, perhaps opportunity. The woman drew a deep breath, steadying herself, feeling the blood in her veins like a drum of determination. Outside, the desert waited, untamed and wide. Inside, the storm of human greed and courage raged. And in the space between, her life and the choices she would soon make hung precariously, shimmering with possibility. The stranger's gaze met hers once more, steady and unyielding. He had no answers yet, no promises, only a conviction that some things like her freedom, like her worth, could not be bartered or sold. She felt a quiet surge of strength, the first in years, and understood that the night ahead would test every ounce of her courage. The first stars had faded, leaving the horizon dark and endless. Somewhere in that darkness, she knew the future was waiting in. Nothing would ever be the same. The night stretched on, heavy and silent outside the saloon, but inside the air thrummed with tension. The stranger's presence seemed to shift the very balance of the room, pulling at every unspoken fear and long-buried secret. The woman watched her husband, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the stranger and the door, as if weighing escape against confrontation. For him, the world had always been transactional, each choice measured in debts and gains. But now, for the first time, the rules he had relied on so heavily were crumbling around him, and the certainty that had once given him confidence had turned brittle. She felt the weight of the town's gaze on her as well. Men and women who had spent their lives in quiet observation, gossiping behind shutters or behind doors, now leaned closer to the saloon windows, drawn by the palpable tension. Whispers rustled like dry leaves in the wind. Some expressed fear, others curiosity, and a few, perhaps the rare few, wondered if justice could exist in a place where survival had always trumped morality. She realized the stakes were no longer just her husband's debt or her own freedom. The entire town, in a way, had become a silent jury, watching to see how courage and choice would clash with greed and fear. The stranger stepped toward the table again, careful and measured. His boots scuffed softly against the worn floorboards, but each step carried an authority that made the gambler flinch. "Debts have a way of catching up with us," he said quietly. Eyes locked on the man, but not all debts are meant to be paid with lives. Not all debts are meant to erase the humanity of another. The words were simple, but in the quiet that followed, they echoed louder than any shout. Her husband sneered, though it did little to disguise the tremor beneath his bravado. "You think you can tell me what's right?" he spat. "You don't know this world. You don't know the people in it. Things happen here because men have to survive." He glanced around as if to draw support from the townsfolk, but most eyes remained downcast or fixed on the floorboards. Not one moved. No one spoke. The silence itself seemed to side with the stranger. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the smell of smoke from distant fires and the faint temps of dry earth. The woman could feel the land pressing in around them, ancient and untamed, as though the desert itself recognized the moment and held its breath. Her thoughts drifted again to the months leading up to this night, the days of quiet tension at home. The nights spent listening to her husband's muttered threats, the gnawing fear that she had been powerless to prevent the worst. And yet, despite all that, something had shifted now, something that made the hair at the back of her neck rise and her heart pound with a new sense of possibility. The stranger did not break eye contact with her husband. "There are other ways to settle matters," he said, calm but unwavering. "Ways that do not involve harming someone who cannot defend themselves. And there are choices that define a man more than any debt ever could." His words cut into the gambler's ego like a cold knife, exposing the cracks that fear and desperation had hidden. The woman noticed the subtle signs of her husband's struggle, the tight line of his lips, the way his fingers dug into the edge of the table, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was clear he had never imagined anyone standing up to him like this, much less for her sake. And yet, in that doubt, a seed of something more dangerous was planted. He had always been cunning, always looking for an angle. If he could not buy her, he would look for another way to reclaim control, and the woman felt the tension tighten in her chest like a coiled rope. At that moment, the door swung open with a sudden force, and the shadow from earlier stepped inside fully. The newcomer who had lingered on the threshold revealed himself to be not just one man, but the first of several figures emerging from the darkness. Their faces were obscured by scarves and hats, their horses tied just outside, restless and stamping the ground. The stakes had shifted from a personal confrontation to something larger, a collision between forces she could barely comprehend. She felt the stranger's gaze on her, calm but assessing. And she understood without words that this was a test, not just of courage, but of trust. He had brought reinforcements, but they were not there to fight her battles for her. They were there to offer choice, to stand with her if she chose to act. And choice, she realized, had been denied to her for far too long. Her husband's eyes narrowed, but now the arrogance had hardened into calculation. He leaned back slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You don't understand what's coming," he muttered to the woman, though she barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. "There are things you can't control. You think he can protect you, but the world is not that simple." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man who had once been charming, but the man consumed by fear and greed. And she understood that no stranger, no friend, no town could shield her completely from the consequences of her own choices. Her freedom would not be given, it would be claimed. The stranger spoke again, turning his attention to the newcomers. "Keep watch," he said quietly. "Nothing leaves this room without my knowledge. No one is to interfere unless I give the signal." There was a rhythm to his words, a cadence that implied experience, leadership, and a knowledge of dangers both seen and unseen. The woman felt the weight of that authority pressing down, and she felt both relief and unease. Protection could be a balm, but it could also make her dependent, and she had spent years learning that reliance on others could be dangerous. She thought then of the people she had known growing up in this town, of the neighbors who had smiled kindly but said nothing when injustice occurred. Some had been too afraid to act, others too tired. She realized the story was repeating but differently. She could feel it, the possibility of courage, of resistance, of rewriting what had always been considered inevitable. And yet the fear of reprisal lingered, coiling in her stomach like smoke from a distant fire. The gambler's face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the last vestiges of control. "You can't do this," he said, voice sharp but uncertain. "This is my business, my debt, my rules." The stranger shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The rules of your world end where another person's life begins. She has no price. Remember that." The words were more than a declaration. They were a warning, an assertion of a principle that would not bend to greed or fear. The woman felt her own pulse quicken as she realized the true depth of the night's conflict. It was not just about debts or threats. was about choice, about power, about the right to live on one's own terms, in a world that often denied such rights. She thought of the years she had spent in silence, whispered prayers and small acts of defiance, the tiny rebellions that had kept her spirit alive. Tonight, all of that had come to a head, and the future depended on whether she could harness the courage that had always been within her. The new arrivals exchanged quiet words, barely audible, and their presence created a new layer of tension in the room. They were strangers, yet their loyalty to the one who had spoken for her was clear. The woman wondered at the stories behind their eyes, the journeys that had brought them to this remote town, and the dangers they had likely faced in the wide, untamed lands beyond. Each of them added weight to the night, a mix of threat and protection, mystery and promise. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant hooves again, this time faster, more urgent, as if riding from beyond the hills with news or peril. The woman's breath caught, and she realized the night was far from over. Decisions were coming, risks were inevitable, and the consequences of every choice would ripple outward, touching not just her, but the town, the strangers, and even her husband. She felt the stranger's gaze on her once more, calm, steady, unyielding. The promise in his eyes was not protection alone, but recognition that she was capable of standing, capable of making decisions that would shape not just this night, but the course of her life. And as the wind rattled the boards and the hooves drew closer, she understood something fundamental. The battle ahead would not be fought with force alone. It would be fought with courage, with the will to assert one's own worth in a world that had never seen it as equal. Her husband shifted uneasily, sensing the undercurrent of challenge in the room. The gambler in him wanted to act, to reclaim control by any means necessary, but the man who had always relied on predictable fear now faced unpredictability. The woman felt that tension like a live wire in the air, ready to snap at any moment. She knew that what came next would define everything. Yet she also sensed that it was not too late for her to choose the path she wanted. The stranger's voice cut through the momentary pause, quiet but commanding. Decisions are coming. Choose carefully. Protect what matters. Nothing beyond this room can dictate your worth. And with that, the room seemed to hold its breath again, suspended between past and future, fear and courage, power and principle. Outside, the night pressed in like a living thing. The stars shimmered faintly, distant witnesses to a story that had only just begun. The woman felt the weight of possibility, the pull of danger, and the sharp edge of choice, knowing that the next moments would set the course for everything that followed. The doors rattled once more, and the faint sound of hooves, voices, and shifting wind hinted that the night's true tests were still approaching. The saloon, the town, the desert beyond, all waited, silent and watchful, for the decisions that would not only determine her fate, but the balance of power in a place where freedom had always been hard won. The woman squared her shoulders, steadying her breathing. She would not be a pawn, a ledger entry, or a debt. She would be herself, no matter what came next. The night stretched before her, dark and full of uncertainty, but she was ready to face it. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the storm that would decide everything was already moving. The wind howled like a living thing through the empty streets outside the saloon, whipping dust and dry leaves into swirling patterns that danced across the boardwalks. Inside, the air was thick with tension, each heartbeat echoing in the dim light, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Stood near the door, steady and composed, while the woman shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands clenched at her sides. The gambler's glare was sharp, dangerous, but behind it lay something more primalia, fear that had been brewing ever since the stranger had spoken the words no one had dared to say aloud: "She has no price." Her husband's fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the table. She could see the beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cool night air. He was trying to calculate, to measure the risk in the room, yet every glance at the stranger seemed to shake his confidence further. The woman's heart beat faster, a mixture of fear, defiance, and anticipation swirling inside her. She had long imagined that confrontation might come, but never in such a charged public way, with witnesses leaning from the shadows and every word weighing like a stone. Outside, the distant sound of hooves grew louder, and a faint cry echoed through the desert night. The town itself seemed tense with expectation, quiet buildings and empty streets anticipating a moment that would break the ordinary rhythm of life. The woman's thoughts drifted for a second, to the years of quiet endurance she had lived through, the long silences, the nights spent awake with worry and planning, and she felt a surge of resolve. No longer could she be silent. No longer could she allow the world to dictate the limits of her courage. The gambler leaned forward suddenly, his voice low but sharp, slicing through the quiet. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he warned, though his tone carried less certainty than he intended. "There are people out there in the hills and the canyons who won't stand by if you try to interfere. You think your friends or your hired hands can't stop them?" The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly, but his posture did not change. "I know exactly what I am dealing with," he said quietly, "and I know that some things are worth standing for. Some debts are not meant to be paid in fear or cruelty. We will see who acts with courage and who acts out of desperation." His voice had a weight to it, the kind that came from knowing the land, knowing people, and knowing what it truly meant to survive. The woman felt a chill run through her, but it was not entirely fear. There was excitement in the edge of it, the realization that she was witnessing the unspooling of events that could reshape everything she had ever accepted as normal. She glanced at the newcomers who had followed the stranger, their faces partly hidden by scarves and hats, but she could sense their alertness, the readiness to act if necessary. There was a strange comfort in knowing that she was not alone, yet a persistent awareness that no one could fight her battles for her. The gambler's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, hands gripping the sides of the table. "You don't understand," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Can't fight what's coming. The debts, the alliances, the threats. They're bigger than this room, bigger than this town. You don't know what it takes to survive here?" The stranger's gaze flicked to the woman, then back to her husband. "Survival is not measured by cruelty or control," he said slowly. "It is measured by the choices we make when every option is dangerous, when every path could lead to harm. Some people survive by fear, others survive by courage. Tonight, we will see which is stronger." A low rumble echoed from the distance, perhaps the sound of approaching riders, perhaps a warning carried on the desert wind. The woman felt it in her chest, a vibration that mirrored the rhythm of her own pulse. The town had grown quiet again, as if waiting, and the saloon itself seemed to shrink, every shadow deepening, every flicker of lamplight amplifying the sense of unease. Her husband's face twisted, the careful mask of control slipping, slammed his fists against the table, sending glasses rattling and spilling their contents across the rough wood. "You think you can defy me?" shouted, voice cracking under the strain. "I've survived worse than you. I've survived storms, bandits, fire. You think words can stop me?" The stranger did not flinch. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, and the gambler's eyes widened, as if realizing for the first time that fear could be larger than experience, that courage could outweigh years of cunning. "Words can stop a man who has lost his way," the stranger said, voice calm but firm. "They can remind him that some things some people are beyond price. You may have survived by calculation, but survival without honor is not living. It is existing." The woman felt a flicker of hope, a tiny flame that she had kept hidden for so long. Yet the tension in the room reminded her that hope alone was fragile. Her husband's temper and desperation were unpredictable, and the newcomers outside the door added another layer of complexity. She did not know whether they would act, and she did not know what might arrive from the desert beyond. The riders who had been moving silently across the hills, unseen but present. Suddenly, a commotion at the back door drew every eye. A shadow passed over the threshold, and the sound of hooves struck the wooden floorboards in rapid succession. The woman stiffened. The riders were close now, too close to ignore. She could feel the air shift, a tangible electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was a warning, a reminder that the night was far from over and that danger could come from anywhere, at any moment. Her husband's face was pale now, his bravado failing him. "You don't know what they're capable of," he said, voice trembling. "They won't listen. They don't follow rules. They kill." The stranger's expression remained unreadable. But the woman could see the focus in his eyes, the calculation, the awareness that danger had many faces and that all of them were to be met with measured action. He glanced briefly at her, then at the back door, and she understood that he was planning, anticipating, readying for whatever might come through that threshold. The wind outside rattled the saloon once more, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and smoke. The town remained quiet, the buildings silent witnesses, as though the land itself were waiting for the coming storm. The woman felt her pulse thundering in her ears, each beat a reminder that the night could change everything. She thought of the years of quiet endurance, of compromise, of fear that had shaped her life, and realized that all of it had led to this moment. She would not be silent now. She would not be a pawn. The choices before her were dangerous, yes, but they were also her own. The strangers outside shifted, their presence adding a new tension, a silent readiness that made the air crackle. The gambler's hands twitched, and the sweat on his brow seemed to glimmer in the lamplight. He was calculating, yet the room was no longer his domain. The balance had shifted, and he could feel it. The woman sensed it too, a current of possibility mixed with peril, pulling her forward even as her stomach knotted with fear. A sudden movement in the doorway caught her attention. One of the newcomers had stepped in fully, revealing a rifle across their shoulder. Eyes scanning the room, alert to every subtle gesture, every twitch of a hand. The woman felt a cold thrill. She had been taught to expect betrayal, but here was loyalty, quiet and unwavering. In defense of her right to exist beyond debt or claim, yet that loyalty brought no guarantees. The desert outside remained vast, untamed, and unpredictable. Her husband's voice rose again, shaking now with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can protect her?" he demanded of the stranger. "You think you know the rules? Out there beyond this town, there is no law, no mercy. People survive by fear, by force." The stranger's gaze hardened. "And people survive by choice," he said, "by courage, by standing when others bow. We will see whose path is stronger, whose principles hold, and whose heart endures under pressure." The woman's chest tightened, every muscle alert. She could feel the tension in the room as a living thing crawling over her skin. And she realized that the climax of all the long struggles, the debts, the threats, the fear, the quiet endurance of her own spirit was approaching. The wind outside carried a low, rolling sound now, like distant drums, and she knew the desert had its own role in the night's unfolding. The approaching riders, the shifting alliances, the unspoken threat of violence, it all converged into a single point, a moment where courage, fear, and choice would collide. Every eye in the room watched the stranger, her husband, and the newcomers, waiting, anticipating, knowing the tension could erupt at any second. The woman felt a surge of determination, a clarity she had not known she possessed. The night was not hers to command, but her actions, her choices, would define what happened next. Outside, the first stars had dimmed beneath the looming clouds of dust and wind. The air vibrated with anticipation, carrying a sense of imminent danger, and a promise that the coming hours would test every instinct, every decision, every ounce of courage. The woman squared her shoulders, drew a steadying breath, and met the stranger's calm, unwavering gaze. She understood that the climax was approaching, and the moment of truth when fear, greed, and courage would collide was almost upon them. The saloon seemed to pulse with suspense, every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind, every shadow deepening into something larger, something alive. The woman's heart raced, knowing that in the next moments, the fragile balance of the night would shatter, and nothing would remain as it had been. The desert outside, the silent town, the uncertain strangers, everything was converging toward that one pivotal point where action and consequence would meet. She could only wait, breath held, mind sharp, body tense. For the moment that would decide everything, The tension in the saloon snapped like a taut wire. A sudden gust of wind rattled the doors, scattering dust and loose papers across the floor. Outside, the hooves of approaching riders thundered closer, and the desert seemed to hold its breath, watching. The woman stood frozen for a moment, heart hammering, but the stranger's calm presence steadied her. He moved forward slightly, signaling subtly to the newcomers who had arrived with him. Their rifles were raised, eyes scanning the threshold, prepared for whatever might step into the light. Her husband's face was a mask of desperation, his bravado now crumbling under the weight of the night. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The realization that his control over the situation had slipped entirely began to etch itself across his features. All his plans, all his attempts to manipulate and command, had failed. The room had shifted beneath him, and he could feel it. Fear and uncertainty had replaced the certainty that had carried him for so long. The stranger's voice cut through the quiet. It's over. Whatever debts you thought could be balanced with someone else's life, they end here. She chooses, not you. His tone was firm, unwavering, and it carried a weight that the gambler could not ignore. The first time, he felt powerless, exposed not by law or violence, but by principle and courage. The woman drew a deep breath, her chest rising and falling, as she felt years of fear and restraint finally begin to lift. She had faced this man countless times in her mind, imagining how she would respond, imagining herself standing firm. And now, standing in the dim lamplight of the saloon, she finally understood that she had the power to shape her own fate. The gambler's greed and desperation had no claim here. No law, no custom, no fear could touch her where her courage stood. Her husband tried to recover, his voice cracking as he spat words that once carried weight. You don't understand. I've survived worse. I'll survive this. She is mine. She's my responsibility, my right. The stranger shook his head slowly. Responsibility is protection. Ownership is control. You have confused the two for too long. He stepped closer, his eyes steady, unwavering. Tonight proves that some debts are beyond coin. Some lives are beyond price. Your choices end here. The gambler's hands dropped to his sides. His chest heaved with the effort of holding back panic. Around him, the room seemed alive with a quiet, almost tangible sense of resolution. Tension held just enough to remind everyone that the stakes had been real, but the threat had passed. The strangers who had arrived remained poised, a silent shield, their presence a subtle but undeniable statement. She was no longer alone, no longer a pawn. The woman's gaze swept over them, feeling gratitude, but also a fierce awareness that her freedom had been won not through violence, but through courage, principle, and the assertion of her own worth. It was a moment she had imagined for years, and now, experiencing it, she realized that the triumph was not in defeating her husband, but in reclaiming herself. She had been silenced, threatened, and undervalued for too long, and now she had a voice and the right to use it. Outside, the first pale light of dawn began to touch the horizon, washing the desert in soft golden rose. The approaching riders slowed, the silhouettes of their horses growing clearer. They were no longer an immediate threat. Whatever intentions they had had were now secondary to the authority that had asserted itself inside the saloon. The desert itself seemed to relax, as though acknowledging that justice had been done, not through law or punishment, but through courage and principle. Her husband slumped into a chair, head in his hands, muttering words that held no power. The fear and anger that had fueled him for so long had finally drained away, leaving only the bare realization that his choices had failed. For a moment, the woman felt a pang of pity, not for him as a husband, but for the life he had led, a life ruled by fear and greed, capable of understanding the courage it took to act with integrity. The stranger stepped closer to her, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no need for words. She felt the calm strength in his presence, the assurance that she could face the world ahead. The newcomers, still vigilant, lowered their rifles slightly, their job done. She understood that the night had been more than a confrontation. It had been a turning point. She had been given a choice, and she had claimed it. The townspeople who had been observing from the shadows began to emerge slowly, their movements tentative at first. They had seen courage stand up to greed and fear, and it had changed something in them. Quiet murmurs spread through the town, But they were no longer whispers of judgment, they were whispers of hope. Of recognition that a person's value could not be measured in debts or barter. The woman realized that her actions tonight, though small in the scale of the world, had left a mark on the town itself. The gambler finally looked up, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. There was no fight left in him, no threat that could hold. He had been stripped of the power he had relied on for so long, and now he had nothing but the cold truth of his choices. The woman did not gloat, did not need to. The night had already spoken, and its judgment was clear. She was no longer a prisoner of fear, and he was no longer a master of circumstance. She stepped closer to the stranger, her chest still racing, but a quiet determination settling in her bones. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt too small to carry the depth of gratitude she felt. His eyes met hers, steady and calm. He nodded, not in heroism, but in recognition. They had faced the night together, and now she had the strength to face what came next on her own terms. The desert outside stretched wide and open, vast and untamed, full of possibilities and dangers alike. She realized that freedom was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. The desert wind carried a promise of life unbound by the debts or fears that had once controlled her. It was a harsh, demanding world, but it was hers to navigate now. Guided by courage and the knowledge that her worth could not be measured in coin or threat, the townspeople began to disperse slowly, the quiet streets gradually returning to their normal rhythm. But the air still held the memory of the night, a reminder of courage, choice, and the power of standing up for what is right. The woman knew that she would carry that memory with her forever, a compass for the decisions yet to come. Her husband remained seated, silent and subdued. The stranger mounted his horse, ready to leave, and the newcomers followed quietly. They had fulfilled their role, but their presence had done more than protect. They had reminded her and a town of something fundamental, that no person should ever be considered property. No life could be measured in debt. The woman stepped outside, breathing in the crisp dawn air. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a world both harsh and beautiful, full of dangers and opportunities alike. She felt the sun warming her face, the wind tangling her hair. And she understood that the night's trials had not ended in destruction, but in clarity. Her life was her own, and she would chart its course with eyes open and heart unflinching. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the town, the woman turned back for a moment. The saloon, with its rough boards and lingering echoes of confrontation, stood as a testament to the night that had changed everything. She had reclaimed her voice, her agency, and her freedom, and in doing so, had shifted the course not only of her own life, but of the quiet town that had watched and learned from her courage. She walked down the dusty main street, steady and unafraid, the sound of her boots on the wooden boards a steady rhythm of determination. The gambler watched from the saloon doorway, a silent witness to the consequences of his choices. He would live with them, and perhaps in time, understand the difference between control and respect, between fear and true courage. The stranger and his companions disappeared toward the horizon, shadows fading into the brightening desert morning. The woman remained for a moment, feeling the weight of what had passed and the lightness of what was now possible. She had endured, she had chosen, and she had reclaimed the life that had been threatened. The debt was settled, but not in gold or threat. It was settled in courage, principle, and the recognition of human worth. She lifted her chin, drawing a deep breath of the desert air, and stepped forward into the new day. The past could not be erased, but it no longer dictated her. The town would remember tonight, and she would carry its lessons with her. A reminder that the most powerful actions are those taken with conscience, bravery, and respect for the lives of others. The wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of sagebrush, dust, and the first warmth of the sun. The woman felt her chest expand with hope, understanding at last that freedom, respect, and self-worth were treasures no one could take away. The town would rebuild, lives would continue, she would continue on her own path, guided by courage and the knowledge that she had claimed what was always hers to own, her life, her voice, her choice. And as the day began fully, the desert wide and endless before her, the woman walked with quiet confidence, the lessons of the night etched in her heart, and the understanding that some truths, courage, worth, freedom could never be bought, only earned and defended.